Hello, welcome to the next Sunday School lesson. This is the lesson for February 24th, 2021. Our passage that we're going to be focusing on for this lesson is Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through, verses 1 through 11. There's two stories that are mentioned in the narrative here that Luke is sharing with us about Jesus and his response to the Sabbath. What Luke is trying to establish is that Jesus himself claimed to be the Lord of the Sabbath, and that he was basically Lord over all things, but he's considered to be uh, specifically the Lord of the Sabbath. And what was going on here was this: we have a situation in the context of where we're looking at this passage where Jesus was. He had quite a following established. He had healed a lot of people, and people were following around. He was teaching a lot of people, the scriptures, and people were looking at him as a teacher, and people, of course, were following him and listening to what they said. And the Pharisees and the scribes kind of had a problem with this. They didn't know how to take this, and in many cases, there's probably perhaps a real issue with jealousy going on, where the scribes and the Pharisees were not grasping the heart and the mind of the people where Jesus was doing just that. So the Pharisees were a bit jealous. They were following around trying to trip him up, and this is where we find this passage of scripture is dressed in that context where Jesus has been teaching and preaching. He's had some confrontations with the Pharisees and the scribes, and he's kind of not giving them any slack. He's kind of calling them out on their hypocrisy, and that's what we have here in the passage. We're going to read through it to kind of get a flow for what's going on. Luke puts two stories together, both dealing with Jesus' response to being accused of not keeping the Sabbath, which was part of the Jewish law. And we're going to see that Jesus was not so much trying to abolish the Sabbatical laws that were established by Moses, but he was clarifying them in the lives and the hearts of the Pharisees, and putting them in the right perspective. And I think one of the things that we're going to learn as we look at this is that many times we, as Christians, tend to get our focus on the wrong things. We tend to make big deals out of things that aren't as big a deal, and we tend to consider to be a small deal things that are a big deal. We get things out of kilter a lot of the time. So let's just read through the passage, and then we'll make some comments as we go through, and we'll seek some ways that we can apply it to our own lives as we move forward in our Christian walk. So let's look at this is Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Verses 1 through 11, rather. It says, "Now it happened that he was passing through some of the grain fields on the Sabbath, that his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. Some of the Pharisees says, 'Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And Jesus answering them said, 'Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him. Now he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat except the priests alone. And he gave it to his companions. And he was saying to them, The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And on another Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And there was a man whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Get up and come forward.' And he got up and he came forward, and Jesus said to them, 'I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or destroy it?' After looking around at all of them, he said to them, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus." A pretty simple story, doesn't need a whole lot of explanation, but what we have here is we have Jesus and his disciples are entering into an area, and they're walking through a grain field. And as they're walking by, they're just kind of going by, and they're just kind of picking some of the heads of grain off of the bushes, off the plants, and rubbing them in their hands to get the husk off the grains, and then just eating it, just like you would if you're picking blackberries, as we may do. Sometimes as you're walking through the woods and you see something that's edible, you just go ahead and eat it. And that's kind of what the disciples were doing. Now the Pharisees were obviously following Jesus and his disciples around, perhaps to find ways to trip them up, perhaps to find ways to just, perhaps they were just curious of what was going on. Who knows what their motivation was? I kind of have a feeling that they were probably following him around, trying to find ways that they can, particularly on the Sabbath, in order to find ways that they can try to trip up Jesus. But what they did is they found that his disciples, as they were walking through the fields, were doing this. Now, this is not something that was wrong for them to do. It was not illegal for them as they went through fields to grab something off the bushes or off the plants and eat it. That was one of the things that was prescribed in the Levitical law, that was allowed. It wasn't something that was forbidden by any means. It wasn't considered to be pilfering. It was part of the Jewish law and tradition that you could do that and it was fine and no one was to argue with you. In fact, the people who planted fields would often plant extra just for that very purpose, for those people who are needy and those people who may be traveling through. And it's not like they were going through trampling over their plants and that kind of stuff. They were most likely walking on a path that was designed for such a thing as they passed through agricultural areas in order to get from one place to the other. And it was very common practice, and it wasn't anything wrong with it. The Pharisees never accused the disciples of doing anything wrong there. The problem that they had was that they were doing this on the Sabbath. Now, of course, it wasn't against the Jewish law to eat on the Sabbath. The problem that the Pharisees apparently had was the action of them rubbing it in their hands to get the husk off. They considered that to be work. And of course, on the Sabbath there was to be nobody doing work. Now, obviously this was not strenuous labor, and obviously they had misinterpreted what was going on and what the disciples were doing, and accused them of working on the Sabbath. Now, you have to understand that what was going on here in this day and age was that the law was given by Moses that did specifically forbid people from working on the Sabbath. The Bible says even back as far as we was given the Ten Commandments, that going back even to the point of creation, that God worked for 6 days on creation and rested on the seventh, and it uses that as you look at the Ten Commandments being given, that we are to keep the Sabbath and keep it holy because for that very reason that God worked for 6 days and rested on the seventh. And we have to understand what the purpose of the Sabbath truly is and was during that day. God knows our human hearts and human condition, and He understands that we need a time of rest. He understands that if left to our own devices, most likely most of us would work constantly, and we would hardly ever get any time to rest and to focus our attention on God. So He's prescribed the Sabbath day, and that we were to keep it holy. Today, it's uncommon for people to actually keep the Sabbath as it is prescribed in the Jewish tradition. But I do think it's a very important part of a person's spiritual walk that they do have a day to rest and to focus on their relationship with God. I think it's interesting that a lot of times we as Christians we get our perspective wrong. When we talk about the Sabbath and its intention, as the Bible says, it says that you're to work for 6 days and take the day of rest on the seventh and worship and take the day of rest. And of course, in Western culture, a lot of times we don't work 6 days. We work 5 days and have 2 days of rest. And that's kind of the way we do many times. And I think it's important that we realize that both sides of that coin are there, that we as Christians, we really should be getting our day of rest on the Sabbath. We should be respecting that and keeping that tradition of resting and worshiping on one day of the week. But it also, the flip side of that is we should possibly be working 6 days a week, which we don't really do. So it's kind of interesting to me that we many times in our Christian walk here in the United States and our Christian lives, we kind of take advantage of things that we shouldn't. The Bible prescribes that we should have one day of rest, and we decide that we need to have 2 days of rest. But we don't really rest on either one of them. It's kind of interesting the way we do. So it's one of the things that I think is interesting. But what's going on here is that the Pharisees historically, even in the time of Jesus, were not necessarily keeping the law, and the things that they were prescribing were not things that were detailed out in the law of Moses. What they were is they were extra teachings, rabbinical teachings that were given to the Jewish people in order to keep them from actually breaking the law of Moses. So whereas the law of Moses may say that you should have no work on the Sabbath and you should take the day of rest, what the Pharisees would do is they'd come up with all kinds of 40 specific different laws that had to do with what you could do and couldn't do on the Sabbath in order to keep you from getting to the point where you might accidentally do some work on the Sabbath. And there's a long list of those things of what they are and whether how detailed they were of what you could do and what you couldn't do, what was permitted and what was not permitted. And it's like many people do all the time, where they take a good thing and they add extra things to it in order to make it to keep you from doing the bad thing. There are many Christians out there today, and I don't want to get into a lot of details because of different people's or different groups of Christian groups' ways of thinking about different aspects of society. But they take things that may be good things, but they take it to the extreme and they make it burdensome. And then they back up even further and they say, well, if you break this part of the law, it's so close to doing this or falling into this sin that this is also a sin, where God never said that was particularly a sin. So they add to the things that are considered to be sinful because they're trying to keep us from actually getting into a even worse sin, and they put more emphasis on the not doing the things than they do on the actual sinful activities or the things that are being prevented. The Pharisees were no different. They were so zealous about their intent not to break the Sabbath that they would add things to it that weren't necessarily prescribed in the law of Moses. And that's what Jesus is calling them out on, is how they are adding to the law, and they're not getting the spirit of the law, but just the letter of the law. And they're not understanding what's really the point of the law was. So Jesus doesn't necessarily here seek to abolish the keeping of the Sabbath. I want to make that clear. What he does do is he clarifies the point of what the purpose of the Sabbath was. So if you look at what's going on in Jesus' response to the Pharisees, and I do want you to notice that the Pharisees didn't approach Jesus about this. They confronted the disciples about this. And of course, Jesus came to their defense. So, as it says there, it says his disciples were picking the grains of grain and rubbing them in their hands and eating the grain. And some of the Pharisees saw it and questioned them about it. Jesus was not necessarily doing it, although he would be perfectly in his right to do so. But Jesus comes to the defense and says, "Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry?" Now, it's kind of interesting to me that Jesus, in his defense and his explanation of what's going on, refers to David, which the Pharisees considered to be, the man after God's own heart, and David basically could do no wrong, but yet he kind of uses David's name and kind of drops that into the hat as he's rebuking the Pharisees. It says that basically he refers them back to a story in the life of David where he was hungry, he was fleeing from Saul who was seeking to kill him, and he and his men were hungry, and it happened to have been on the Sabbath, and they were entering into the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to eat. Now, if you look back and look at that story, there's a priest who, David and his men approached one of the priests and said, "Do you have anything to eat? My men are starving. We need something to eat." And the only thing that was available was the bread, the consecrated bread, which was not permitted for anybody to eat other than the priest. Now, this bread was designed to be placed into the tabernacle, into the holy place, in order to be part of the worship ceremonies. And it was consecrated. It was not lawful for anyone to eat except for the priest alone. But this priest gave David permission and gave him the bread in order for him to meet the needs that David and his men had at that moment. And Jesus uses this comparison, or this story, in order to show the true meaning of the Sabbath, that it wasn't so much about the keeping of the law, but it was about understanding the purpose of the law, and that there could be exceptions to those things if the need arose. The Pharisees themselves would permit people if they're one of their animals, in order to prevent the loss of life or to save someone's livelihood, that they could do things. If you use the example in the scriptures using about if your ox falls into a pit, wouldn't you not even on the Sabbath go and get it out? Of course you would. So there are things that could be done in order to save life and to preserve life, and to meet people's needs. And what Jesus is saying, look, what's more important, the need of the people, or keeping the law? And obviously the answer to that question is the needs of the people that are involved. And that's what Jesus is saying. He says David himself ate of the consecrated bread. So what's the big deal about the disciples picking off grains of grain as they walk through the field and rubbing it in their hands and eating it? It was a perfectly normal behavior. It's just that the Pharisees had taken it a step too far. And Jesus was calling them out on it. Now the next story, starting in verse 6, and Luke follows up that story with another one that's immediately preceding after that, talking about a situation where Jesus was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and there's a man whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath. You kind of get the picture that this is kind of a setup, that the scribes and the Pharisees were there in the synagogue. Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, and this man was there. Whether he just happened to be there or not, I'm a little bit skeptical myself. I kind of think that the scribes and the Pharisees brought this man there purposely to see if Jesus would do something, if he would heal him on the Sabbath, because they're trying to get him into a trap of actually considering of doing work on the Sabbath in the synagogue. And they probably thought that they had him in a trap that they could pull. They could make some headway with the people over. That what they're going to try to do, I think, is they were trying to get Jesus to either heal him and then accuse him of working on the Sabbath, or to ignore him and not meet that need and accuse him of not taking care of somebody or not healing someone who is in need when they needed it, just because it was inconvenient. So I think what Jesus was realizing, Jesus realized that they had set him up in this little trap that they thought was going to get him. And I think it's interesting, if you look at the scripture, you see the scribes and the Pharisees constantly trying to do this. You see them doing the same thing with the story of dealing with the taxes, them calling out the disciples about whether or not they should be paying taxes, and who's should they be paying tax to Caesar, or what was the point of that? And Jesus, of course, told them to look whose head is on the coin. Who's on the coin? And they said, well, it's Caesar. And it says, written under Caesar is what is Caesar's. We have over and over in the scripture, we have stories of the Pharisees trying to trip up Jesus and try to put him into a trap. And Jesus is kind of masterful in the way he handles these things, and doesn't allow himself to get tied up into the controversies that they're trying to get him to be trapped into. We see it also again in the scriptures, in the situation where the woman who is caught in the act of adultery, and Jesus is there, and they bring the woman out to Jesus and says, what should we do with her? Should we stone her? Because that's what the law prescribes, is that we should stone this woman. And of course we know the story where Jesus just reaches down into the dirt and starts writing into the dirt, and says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. And of course they all dropped their rocks and left. And then Jesus, of course, went about and continued and forgave the woman of her sin. He didn't excuse the sin, and that's what's marvelous about the way Jesus handles things. He always does it right, but keeping in mind that it's the person that really matters, not the law. Bringing them to a right relationship with God is what the most important part of the law is, not the law itself. So as we see here is this story on verse 6 of this passage. So we see Jesus, he's teaching on the Sabbath in the synagogue, and the scribes are watching closely to see if Jesus would heal this man with the withered hand, so they might find reason to accuse him. But when he knew what they were thinking, it says in verse 8, it says, but when he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. I think it's interesting. What Jesus does is he realizes what's going on. He realizes what the Pharisees are trying to accomplish. And instead of just sort of healing the man and there being any question about what he does, he makes a spectacle of it. Not so much a spectacle as in he's trying to draw attention to himself, but he makes sure that everybody knows, everybody sees the point. And he didn't want something to happen and there be controversy about what happened, about the details of what happened. So he makes the man get up. He says, get up and come forward. And he got up and came forward. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it? And again, what Jesus is referring to here is the actual Sabbatical law that said that it was permissible for someone to save a life on the Sabbath. He says in the same vein, is it permissible to destroy it? And he said, and he looked around to all of them, and he said, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. So we have this story where Jesus heals this man from a withered hand, and it says very simply that Jesus didn't do anything as far as work. All he did was speak to heal this man's hand. And he understood what the Pharisees were trying to do. Perhaps they were trying to get him to, as he healed other people, to make mud or something like that, and to cause some spectacle, or to create some work or something to happen. But all Jesus did was speak. He just spoke. He says, "Stretch out your hand," and his hand was healed. And of course, in this situation, the Pharisees couldn't do anything. He set them up. Jesus kind of set them up and said, is it lawful to do harm on the Sabbath, or to save a life or destroy it? And then the man's hand was healed by simply, Jesus asking the question and saying, "Stretch out your hand." So it's interesting to me that the Pharisees really had no recourse at that moment. They couldn't accuse him of breaking the Sabbath because he really didn't do any work. They couldn't accuse him of doing anything wrong because all he did was tell a man to stretch out his hand, and that was it. But it filled them with so much rage. And the word there, it's interesting. It says they themselves were filled with rage. And that word there means that, when it says in the Greek word there, it means filled with rage. It's basically the word that they were out of their minds. They were so enraged, they were so mad that they were losing control of themselves, losing control of their rationality. It says they were so filled with rage, and they discussed together what they might do with Jesus. I think this is one of the things that Jesus, as he was interacting with the Pharisees, he took their traps and kind of turned it back on themselves. And that was the kind of interesting stuff, and it really would infuriate the Pharisees. What was going on here, I think, in a lot of cases, was that Jesus was a threat to the Pharisaical structure, to the current structure of the way things were, and the power that the Pharisees had over the people. The power, the way that they would manipulate the law and manipulate the people in order to accomplish things, in order to get things for themselves, and perhaps to achieve power, over the people. And Jesus was calling them out on it. Jesus was pointing it out to them in front of everyone, and calling out their hypocrisy. And nobody likes to be called a hypocrite. It's one of those things that anytime that you disagree with somebody, you call them a hypocrite, and it seems like you've won the argument. And that's not really the case. Nobody likes to be called a hypocrite, but Jesus kind of turned the table on them. And it's one of the things that I think is interesting, that we need to realize, that we as Christians, many times, we lose perspective as well. We want to look at the Pharisees and their perspective on things, and sometimes we give them a hard time. We look at them and say, "Oh, these are the religious elite, and they're this and they're that." But many times we do the same things. We get our focus on the wrong things all the time. We get our focus less on more on our rituals and our structure and the things that we're comfortable with and our traditions than we do on the things that God has really called us to do as Christians. Many times in churches, we get so focused on our liturgies and the things, the way that we have our worship services, and the way things are designed, and the way things we like things to be, and the way we want people to dress when they go to church, or where they, just all kinds of different things. The times of our services, all those things that we as churches, sometimes we get so hung up on the things that are so insignificant, when what Jesus many times is looking at us and saying, "Look, that's really of no importance whatsoever. I don't care what kind of music you worship me with, or I don't care, what time you have your worship services. I don't care if you have a Sunday night service or you don't have a Wednesday night service, or how you do things necessarily." And one of the things that we've learned going through the COVID thing is that we, as a church, sometimes we have to adapt to the society around us and what's going on, and we have to find new and innovative ways to do things. And as a church, sometimes we have those things that we have to change, and we have to do things differently than we've ever done it before. And I think what Jesus is saying is that, look, what's important is not having the traditions and the rituals and the things that we consider to be the right way to do things. What really matters is people. What really matters is the hearts and lives of individuals, and how can we reach them, and how can we touch them, and how can we better bring them to a closer relationship with Jesus Christ through as a church and as individuals. Not to say that we need to involve ourselves in sinful practices. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that sometimes we get so caught up in our traditions that we lose sight of what the actual goal is. Sometimes we get so caught up in the way doing things the way we've always done it that we lose sight of the fact that perhaps those ways that we've always done it aren't really working anymore. Perhaps society has changed and we're not really being effective. And I think that's one of the things that we as churches and as Christians need to really take it into consideration. Is is the way that we're doing things really effective? Are we really reaching the lost for Christ? Are we really reaching people with the gospel message? And is there things that we're doing that are hindering that message being preached and being taught? And are we getting in the way of what God's trying to do because of our traditions and our rituals and the things that we consider to be dear to us? Perhaps we need to rethink some of those things and think of ways that we can reach people for Christ without dipping into sin. Of course, we don't want to do things that are wrong, that lead people astray. But at the same time, there's a lot of room for us to do things differently in order to reach people. That's outside of the realm of the way we've always done it before. And I think that's one of the lessons that we can take from this, is what Jesus is calling out the Pharisees on, is their insistence on things being the same as they always were. The same way that we have set it up, that Moses said that we should do it, and then the priests and the rabbis got together and added these other requirements and to keep us from falling into sin. And these are the ways that things should be done. And Jesus is saying, look, that's not what was intended. It's never intended to be that way. This is the way the law was intended for. And as long as the purposes are being met, the law can be flexible. And I think it's important that we realize that we cannot get hung up on our traditions and our rituals and doing things the same way when the goal is to reach people for Jesus Christ. And so I think it behooves us to be mindful of Jesus' heart. Jesus' heart is always towards people, and our heart should always be towards people and reaching the lost. And that's it for today's lesson. I just want to bring to your attention, if you are listening to this lesson, that our Sunday school lessons are going to take a different turn starting the first week of March, March 7th, I believe it is. We will be having Sunday school classes in person. They will still be posted on Facebook and done Facebook Live, so you'll still be able to see them there. And perhaps even on the website, I'm not sure, but for sure we'll be doing it on Facebook. So if you're not coming to the church in person, that's fine. We will still have it available for you. But it will be at 9 o'clock to 9:30. We'll be having Sunday school in the sanctuary for the adult classes. Dave and I are going to continue to alternate teaching those weekend, 1 week on, 1 week off, as we're doing now with the video lessons. And our service, our one worship service, we're going to go from having two services back to having one service at 10 o'clock. So Sunday school will be from 9 to 9:30, and then the morning worship service on Sundays will be at 10 o'clock. So I'm looking forward to that, looking forward to being able to interact a little bit with people in Sunday school class. To where we can have some questions and answers and communication back and forth. It's kind of difficult to teach these lessons sometimes just from a video standpoint with no feedback and no interaction. I can't look at your faces and see when I'm not making sense. So it'll be good to have people actually in the sanctuary in order to interact with that. So look forward to it. I hope that you guys will definitely make plans to try to be there in person. There's plenty of room, I think, that we can still socially distance and stay safe, but yet still meet together for our Bible study time. If you have any questions about that or any concerns, let us know. There will be new books that will be coming in, new Sunday school books. If you're looking at your Sunday school lesson, you know there's only 2 more weeks out of this book. Those books will be arriving in the next week or so they should be available to be picked up in the sanctuary within the next couple of weeks. For sure. So if you have any questions, let us know in the comments or give us a call and let us communicate with us if there's any issues that you need to discuss. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, have a blessed day.